Section 13 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Parallel. The club room looked very like the auditorium of a music hall. Indeed, that is what it must once have been. But now there were tiers of benches on the stage, and on these was packed a quarter or so of the members and their friends. The other 3/4 or so were packed opposite the proscenium and down either side of the hall. And in the middle of this human oblong was a raised platform, roped around. Therefrom, just as I was ushered to my place, a stout man in evening dress was making some announcement. I did not catch its import, but it was loudly applauded. The stout man, most of the audience indeed seemed to have put on flesh, bowed himself off, and disappeared from my ken in the clouds of tobacco smoke that hung about the hall. Almost immediately 2 young people, nimbly insinuating themselves through the rope fence, leapt upon the platform. One was a man of about 20 years of age, the other a girl of about 17. She was very pretty. He was very handsome. Both were becomingly dressed, with evident aim at attractiveness. They proceeded to opposite corners of the platform. At a signal from someone, they advanced to the middle, and each made a hideous grimace at the other. The grimace, strange in itself, was stranger still in the light of what followed. For the young man began to make passionate protestations of love, to which the girl responded with equal ardour. The young man fell to his knees. The girl raised him and clung to his breast. His language became more and more lyrical, his eyes more and more ecstatic. Suddenly, in the middle of a pretty sentence, wherein his love was likened to a flight of doves, a bell rang, whereat, not less abruptly, the couple separated, retiring to the aforesaid corners of the platform, and striking back on their chairs with every manifestation of fatigue. Their friends or attendants, however, rallied round them, counselling them, cooling them with fans, heartening them to fresh endeavour. And when, at the end of a minute, the signal was sounded for a second tryst, the 2 young people seemed fresher and more eager than ever. This time, most of the love-making was done by the girl, the young man joyously drinking in her words, and now and then interpolating a few of his own. There were 4 trysts in all, with 3 intervals for recuperation. At the 4th sound of the bell, the lovers, stepping asunder, repeated their hideous mutual grimace, and disappeared from the platform as suddenly as they had come. Their place was soon taken by another, a more mature and heavier, but not less personable couple, who proceeded to make love in their own somewhat different way. The lyrical notes seemed to be missing in them, but maturity, though it had stripped away magic, had not blunted their passion, had rather sharpened the edge of it, and made it a stronger and more formidable instrument. Throughout the evening, indeed, in the long succession that there was of amorous encounters, it seemed to be the encounters of mature couples that excited in the smoke-laden audience the keenest interest. It was evidently not etiquette to interrupt the lovers while they were talking, but whenever the bell sounded there was a frantic outburst of sympathy, straight from the heart. And sometimes, even while a love scene was proceeding, this or that stout gentleman would snatch the cigar from his lips and emit a hearty cry. Now and again it seemed to be thought that the lovers were insufficiently fervid, were but dallying with passion, and then there were stentorian grunts of disapproval and hortation. I did not gather that the audience itself was composed mainly of active lovers. I guessed that the greater number consisted of men who do but take an active interest in other people's love affairs, men who, vigilant from a detached position, have developed in themselves an extraordinarily sound critical knowledge of what is due to Venus. Plaisir d'amour ne dure qu'un moment, I murmured. Chagrin d'amour dure toute la vie. And wise are ye who, immune from all love's sorrows, win incessant joy in surveying Cythara through telescopes. Suave mari magno, I murmured, and this second tag caused me to awake from my dream shivering. A strange dream? Yet a precisely parallel reality had inspired it. I had been taken overnight, my first visit, to the National Sporting Club. The instinct to fight, like the instinct to love, is a quite natural instinct. To fight and to love are the primary instincts of primitive man. I know that people with strongly amorous natures are not trained and paid to make love ceremoniously, in accordance to certain rules laid down for them by certain authorities, and for the delectation of highly critical audiences. But if this custom prevailed, it would not seem to me stranger than the custom of training and paying pugnacious people to hit one another on the face and breast with the greatest possible skill and violence for the delectation of highly critical audiences. I do not say that a glove fight is in itself a visually distinguished exhibition. I saw no blood spilt the other night, and no bruises expressed by either the light weights or the heavy weights. I dare say, too, that the fighters enjoy their profession on the whole. But I contend that it is a very lamentable profession, in that it depends on the calculated prostitution of good natural energies. A declaration of love prefaced by a grimace, such as I saw in my dream, seems to me not one whit more monstrous than a violent onslaught prefaced by a handshake. If two men are angry with each other, let them fight it out, provided I be not one of them, in the good old English fashion, by all means. But prize fighting is to be deplored as an offence against the soul of man, and this offence is committed not by the fighters themselves, but by us soft and sedentary gentlemen who set them on to fight. Looking back at ancient Rome, no one blames the poor gladiators in the arena. Every one reserves his pious horror for the citizens in the amphitheatre. Yet how are we superior to them? Are we not even as they, suspended at exactly their point between barbarism and civilisation? In course of time, doubtless, the ring will die out. For either we shall become so civilised that we shall not rejoice in the sight of painful violence, or we shall relapse into barbarism and go into the mauling business on our own account. Our present stage, the stage of our transition, is not pretty, I think. End of section 13. Section 14 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Morris for May Day. Not long ago, a prospectus was issued by some more or less aesthetic ladies and gentlemen who deemed modern life not so cheerful as it should be, had laid their cheerless heads together, and decided that they would meet once every month and dance old-fashioned dances in a hall hired for the purpose. Thus would they achieve a renaissance (I am sure they called it a renaissance) of Merry England. I know not whether subscriptions came pouring in. I know not even whether the society ever met. If it ever did meet, I conceive that its meetings must have been singularly dismal. If you are depressed by modern life, you are unlikely to find an anodyne in the self-appointed task of cutting certain capers, which your ancestors used to cut because they, in their day, were happy. If you think modern life so pleasant a thing that you involuntarily prance rather than walk down the street, I dare say your prancing will intensify your joy. Though I happen never to have met him out of doors, I am sure my friend Mr. Gilbert Chesterton always prances thus, prances in some wild way, symbolical of joy in modern life. His steps and the movements of his arms and body may seem to you crude, casual, and disconnected at first sight, but that is merely because they are spontaneous. If you studied them carefully, you would begin to discern a certain rhythm, a certain harmony. You would at length be able to compose from them a specific dance, a dance not quite like any other, a dance formally expressive of New English optimism. If you are not optimistic, don't hope to become so by practising these steps, but practise them assiduously if you are, and get your fellow optimists to practise them with you. You will grow all the happier through ceremonious expression of a light heart. And your children and your children's children will dance the Chesterton when you are no more. Maybe a few of them will still be dancing it, now and then, on this or that devious green, even when the optimism shall have withered for ever from the land. Nor will any man mock at the survival. The dance will have lost nothing of its old grace, and will have gathered that quality of pathos which makes even unlovely relics dear to us, the piteousness which time gives ever to things robbed of their meaning and their use. Spectators will love it for its melancholy not less than for its beauty. And I hope no mere spectator will be so foolish as to say, "Let us do it," with a view to reviving cheerfulness at large. I hope it will be held sacred to those in whom it will be a tradition, a familiar thing, handed down from father to son. None but they will be worthy of it. Others would ruin it. Be sure I trod no measure with the Morris dancers whom I saw last May Day. It was in the wide street of a tiny village near Oxford that I saw them. Fantastic, high fantastical figures they did cut in their finery. But in demeanour they were quite simple, quite serious, these 8 English peasants. They had trudged hither from the neighbouring village that was their home, and they danced quite simply, quite seriously. One of them, I learned, was a cobbler, another a baker, and the rest were farm labourers. And their fathers and their fathers' fathers had danced here before them, even so, every May Day morning. They were as deeply rooted in antiquity as the elm outside the inn. They were here, always, in their season, as surely as the elm put forth its buds. And the elm, knowing them, approving them, let its green-flecked branches dance in unison with them. The first dance was in full swing when I approached. Only 6 of the men were dancers. Of the others, one was the minstrel, the other the dysard. The minstrel was playing a flute, and the dysard I knew by the wand and leathern bladder which he brandished, as he walked around keeping a space for the dancers, and chasing and buffeting merrily any man or child who ventured too near. He, like the others, wore a white smock, decked with sundry ribbons, and a top hat that must have belonged to his grandfather. Its antiquity of form and texture contrasted strangely with the freshness of the garland of paper roses that wreathed it. I was told that the wife or sweetheart of every Morris dancer takes special pains to deck her man out more gaily than his fellows. But this pious endeavour had defeated its own end. So bewildering was the amount of brand new bunting attached to all these 8 men, that no matron or maiden could for the life of her have determined which was the most splendid of them all. Besides his adventitious finery, every dancer, of course, had in his hands the scarves, which are as necessary to his performance of the Morris as are the bells strapped about the calves of his legs. Waving these scarves, and jangling these bells with a stolid rhythm, the 6 peasants danced, facing one another, 3 on either side, while the minstrel fluted and the dysard strutted around. The minstrel's tune runs in my head even now, a queer little stolid tune that recalls vividly to me the aspect of the dance. It is the sort of tune Bottom the Weaver must often have danced to in his youth. I wish I could hum it for you on paper. I wish I could set down for you on paper the sight that it conjures up. But what writer that ever lived has been able to write adequately about a dance? Even a slow, simple dance, such as these peasants were performing, is a thing that not the cunningest writer could fix in words. Did not Flaubert say that if he could describe a valse he would die happy? I am sure he would have said this if it had occurred to him. Unable to make you see the Morris, how can I make you feel as I felt in seeing it? I cannot explain even to myself the effect it had on me. My critics have often complained of me that I lack heart, presumably the sort of heart that is pronounced with a rolling of the R, and I suppose they are right. I remember having read The Death of Little Nell on more than one occasion, without floods of tears. How can I explain to myself the tears that came into my eyes at sight of the Morris? They are not within the rubric of the tears drawn by mere contemplation of visual beauty. The Morris, as I saw it, was curious, antique, racy, what you will, not beautiful, nor was there any obvious pathos in it. Often in London, passing through some slum where a tune was being ground from an organ, I have paused to watch the little girls dancing. In the swaying dances of these wan, dishevelled, dim little girls I have discerned authentic beauty, and have wondered where they had learned the grace of their movements, and where the certainty with which they did such strange and complicated steps. Surely, I have thought, this is no trick of to-day or yesterday. Here, surely, is the remainder of some old tradition. Here, maybe, is Merry England run to seed. There is an obvious pathos in the dances of these children of the gutter, an obvious symbolism of sadness, of a wistful longing for freedom and fearlessness, for wind and sunshine. No wonder that at sight of it even so heartless a person as the present writer is a little touched. But why, at the sight of those rubicund, full-grown, eupeptic Morris dancers on the vernal highroad? No obvious pathos was diffusing itself for them. They were Merry England in full flower. In part, I suppose, my tears were tears of joy for the very joyousness of these men. In part, of envy for their fine simplicity. In part, of sorrow in the thought that they were a survival of the past, not types of the present, and that their knell would soon be tolled, and the old elms see their like no more. After they had drunk some ale, they formed up for a second dance, a circular dance. And anon, above the notes of the flute, and the jangling of the bells, and the stamping of the boots, I seemed to hear the knell actually tolling. Hoot, hoot, hoot! A motor came fussing and fuming in its cloud of dust. Hoot, hoot! The dysard ran to meet it, brandishing his wand of office. He had to stand aside. Hoot! The dancers had just time to get out of the way. The scowling motorists vanished. Dancers and dysard, presently visible through the subsiding dust, looked rather foolish and crestfallen, and all the branches of the conservative old elm above them seemed to be quivering with indignation. In a sense, this elm was a mere parvenu as compared with its beloved dancers. True, it had been no mere sapling in the reign of the 7th Henry, and so could remember distinctly the first Morris danced here. But the first Morris danced on English soil was not by a long chalk the first Morris. Scarves such as these were waved, and bells such as these were jangled, and some such measure as this was trodden, in the mists of a very remote antiquity. Spanish buccaneers, long before the dawn of the 15th century, had seen the Moors dancing somewhat thus to the glory of Allah. Home-coming, they had imitated that strange and savage dance, expressive for them of the joy of being on firm native land again. The Morisco, they called it, and it was much admired. And the fashion of it spread throughout Spain, scaled the very Pyrenees, and invaded France. To the Maurice succumbed tout Paris as quickly as in recent years it succumbed to the cakewalk. A troupe of French dancers braved the terrors of the sea, and with their scarves and their bells danced for the delectation of the English court. The King, it seems, was pleased by the bells and sweet dancing. Certain of his courtiers did presently dance so in open places. No one with any knowledge of the English nature will be surprised to hear that the cits soon copied the courtiers. But the Morris was not for long practised in the city. It went to country places. London, apparently, even in those days, did not breed joy in life. The Morris sought and found its proper home in the fields and by the wayside. Happy carles danced it to the glory of God, even as it had erst been danced to the glory of Allah. It was no longer, of course, an explicitly religious dance, but neither can its origin have been explicitly religious. Every dance, however formal it become later, begins as a mere ebullition of high spirits. The Dionysiac dances began in the same way as the Chesterton. Some Thessalian vintner, say, suddenly danced for sheer joy that the earth was so bounteous, and his fellow vintners, sharing his joy, danced with him, and ere the breath was spent they remembered who it was that had given them such cause for merrymaking, and they caught leaves from the vine and twined them in their hair, and from the fig tree and the fir tree they snatched branches and waved them this way and that as they danced in honour of him who was lord of these trees and of this wondrous vine. Thereafter this dance of joy became a custom, ever to be observed at certain periods of the year. It took on, beneath its joyousness, a formal solemnity. It was danced slowly around an altar of stone, whereon wood and salt were burning with little flames that were pale in the sunlight. Formal hymns were chanted around this altar, and some youth, clad in leopard skin and wreathed with ivy, masqueraded as the god himself, and spoke words appropriate to that august character. It was from these beginnings that sprang the art form of drama. The Greeks never hid the origin of this their plaything. Always, in the centre of the theatre, was the altar of Dionysus, and the chorus circling around it were true progeny of those old agrestic singers, and the mimes had never been but for that masquerading youth. It is hard to realise, yet it is true, that we owe to the worship of Dionysus so dreary a thing as the modern British drama. Strange, that through him who gave us the juice of the grape, fiery, venerable, divine, came this gift too. Yet I dare say the chorus of a musical comedy would not be awestruck, would indeed bridle, if one unrolled to them their illustrious pedigree. The history of the Dionysiac dance has a fairly exact parallel in that of the Morisco. Each dance has travelled far and survives, shorn of its explicitly religious character, and in many other ways diablement changé en route. The Morisco, of course, has changed the less of the two. Besides the scarves and the bells, it seemed to me last May Day that the very steps danced and the figures formed were very like to those of which I had read and which I had seen illustrated in old English and French engravings. Above all, the dancers seemed to retain, despite their seriousness, something of the joy in which the dance originated. They frowned as they footed it, but they were evidently happy. Their frowns did but betoken determination to do well and rightly a thing that they loved doing, were proud of doing. The smiles of the chorus in a musical comedy seem but to express depreciation of a rather tedious and ridiculous exercise. The coryphees are quite evidently bored and ashamed. But these 8 be-ribboned sons of the soil were hardly less glad in dancing than was that antique Moor who, having slain beneath the stars some long-feared and long-hated enemy, danced wildly on the desert sand, and, to make music, tore strips of bells from his horse's saddle, and waved them in either hand while he danced, and made so great a noise that in the night air other Moors came riding to see what had happened, and marvelled at the sight and sound of the dance, and, praising Allah, leapt down and tore strips of bells from their own saddles, and danced as nearly as they could in mimicry of that glad conqueror, to Allah's glory. As this scene is mobled in the aforesaid mists of antiquity, I cannot vouch for the details. Nor can I say just when the Moors found that they could make a finer and more rhythmic jangle by attaching the bells to their legs than by swinging them in their hands. Nor can I fix the day when they tore strips from their turbans for their idle hands to wave. I cannot say how long the rite's mode had been set when first the adventurers from Spain beheld it with their keen wondering eyes, and fixed it forever in their memories. In Spain, and then in France, and then in London, the dance was secular. But perhaps I ought not to have said that it was not explicitly religious in the English countryside. The cult for Robin Hood was a veritable religion throughout the Midland counties. Rites in his honour were performed on certain days of the year with a not less hearty reverence and not less quaint elaboration than was infused into the rustic Greek rites for Dionysus. The English carles danced, not indeed around an altar, but around a burnt pole, crowned with such flowers as were in season, and one of them, like the youth who in the Dionysiac dance masqueraded as the god, was decked out duly as Robin Hood, with a magpie's plume to his cap, we are told, and sometimes a russet beard composed of horse's hair. The most famous of the dances for Robin Hood was the pageant. Herein appeared, besides the hero himself and various tabors and pipers, a dysard or fool, and Friar Tuck, and Maid Marian, in a white kirtle, and her hair all unbraided, but with blossoms therein. This pageant was performed at Whitsun, at Easter, on New Year's Day, and on May Day. The morris, when it had become known in the villages, was very soon incorporated into the pageant. The morris scarves and bells, the morris steps and figures, were all pressed into the worship of Robin Hood. In most villages the properties for the pageant had always rested in custody of the church wardens. The properties for the Morris were now kept with them. In the Kingston accounts for 1537-38 are enumerated a friar's coat of russet, and a girdle welted with red cloth, and Maurin's coat of buckram, and 4 Morris dancers' coats of white fustian spangled, and 2 green satin coats, and Dysard's coat of cotton, and 6 pair of garters with bells. The pageant itself fell, little by little, into disuse. The Morris, which had been affiliated to it, superseded it. Of the pageant nothing remained but the minstrel and the dysard, and an occasional maid Marian. In the original Morris there had been no music save that of the bells. But now there was always a flute or tabor. The dysard, with his rod and leathern bladder, was promoted to a sort of leadership. He did not dance, but gave the signal for the dance, and distributed praise or blame among the performers, and had power to degrade from the troupe any man who did not dance with enough skill or enough hardiness. Often there were in one village 2 rival troupes of dancers, and a prize was awarded to whichever acquitted itself more admirably. But not only the ensemble was considered. A sort of star system seems to have crept in. Often a prize would be awarded to some one dancer who had excelled his fellows. There were, I suppose, born Morris dancers. Now and again one of them, flushed with triumph, would secern himself from his troupe and would star round the country for his livelihood. Such a one was Mr. William Kemp, who, at the age of 17 and in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, danced from his native village to London, where he educated himself and became an actor. Perhaps he was not a good actor, for he presently reverted to the Morris. He danced all the way from London to Norwich, and wrote a pamphlet about it. Kemp's 9 Days' Wonder, performed in a dance from London to Norwich, containing the pleasures, pains, and kind entertainment of William Kemp between London and that city in his late Morris. He seems to have encountered more pleasures than pains. Gentle and simple all the way were very cordial. The gentle entertained him in their mansions by night, the simple danced with him by day. In Sudbury, quote, "There came a lusty tall fellow, a butcher by his profession, that would in a Morris keep me company to Bury. I gave him thanks, and forward we did set. But ere ever we had measured half a mile of our way, he gave me over in the plain field, protesting he would not hold out with me, for indeed my pace in dancing is not ordinary. As he and I were parting, a lusty country lass, being among the people, called him faint-hearted lout, saying, if I had begun to dance, I would have held out 1 mile, though it had cost my life. At which words many laughed. Nay, saith she, if the dancer will lend me leash of his bells, I'll venture to tread 1 mile with him myself. I looked upon her, saw mirth in her eyes, heard boldness in her words, and beheld her ready to tuck up her russet petticoat, and I fitted her with bells, which she merrily taking garnished her thick short legs, and with a smooth brow bade the tabor begin. The drum struck, forward marched I with my merry maid Marian, who shook her stout sides and footed it merrily to Melford, being a long mile. There parting with her, besides her skinful of drink, and English crown to buy more drink, for, good wench, she was in a piteous heat, my kindness she requited with a dropping a dozen good curtsies, and bidding God bless the dancer. I bade her adieu, and, to give her her due, she had a good ear, danced truly, and we parted friends." End quote. Kemp, you perceive, wrote as well as he danced. I wish he had danced less and written more. It seems that he never wrote anything but this one delightful pamphlet. He died 3 years later, in the 30th year of his age. Died dancing, with his bells on his legs, in the village of Ockley. John Thorndrake, another professional Morris dancer, was not so brilliant a personage as poor Kemp, but was of tougher fibre, it would seem. He died in his native town, Canterbury, at the age of 78, and had danced never less than a mile, seldom less than 5 miles, every day, except Sundays, for 60 years. But even his record pales beside the account of a Morris that was danced by 8 men in Hereford one May day in the reign of James I. The united ages of these dancers, according to a contemporary pamphleteer, exceeded 800 years. The youngest of them was 79, and the ages of the rest ranged between 95 and 109. And they danced right well. Of the hold that the Morris had on England, could there be stronger proof than in the feat of these indomitable dotards? The Morris ceased not even during the Civil Wars. Some of King Charles's men, according to Groby the Puritan, danced thus on every Naseby. Not even the Protectorate could stamp the Morris out, though we are told that Groby and other preachers throughout the land inveighed against it as lewd and ungodly. The Restoration was in many places celebrated by special Morrises. The perihelion of this dance seems, indeed, to have been in the reign of Charles II. Georgian writers treated it somewhat as a survival, and were not always even tender to it. Says a writer in Bladud's Courier, describing a soirée de beauté given by Lady Jersey, Mrs. La Belle looked as silly and gaudy, I do vow, as one of the old Morris dancers. And many other writers, from Horace Walpole to Captain Harbour, have their sneer at the Morris. Its rusticity did not appeal to the polite Georgian mind, and its Moorishness, which would have appealed strongly, was overlooked. Still, the Morris managed to survive urban disdain, was still dear to the Carls whose fathers had taught it them. And long may it linger. End of section 14. Section 15 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The House of Commons Manor. A grave and beautiful place, the Palace of Westminster. I sometimes go to that little chamber of it wherein the Commons sit sprawling or stand spouting. I am a constant reader of the graphic reports of what goes on in the House of Commons, and the writers of these things always strive to give one the impression that nowhere is the human comedy so fast and furious, nowhere played with such skill and brio as at St. Stephen's. And I am rather easily influenced by anything that appears in daily print, for I have a burning faith in the sagacity and uprightness of sub-editors. And so, when the memory of my last visit to the House has lost its edge, and when there is a crucial debate in prospect, to the House I go, full of hope that this time I really shall be edified or entertained. With an open mind I go, reeking naught of the pros and cons of the subject of the debate. I go as to a gladiatorial show, eager to applaud any man who shall wield his sword brilliantly. If a stranger indulge in applause, he is tapped on the shoulder by one of those courteous, magpie-like officials, and conducted beyond the precincts of the Palace of Westminster. I speak from hearsay. I do not think I have ever seen a stranger applauding. My own hands certainly never have offended. Years ago, when to be a member of the House of Commons was to be, or to deem oneself, a personage of great importance, the debates were conducted with a keen eye to effect. Members who had a sense of beauty made their speeches beautiful, and even those to whom it was denied did their best. Grace of ample gesture was cultivated, and sonorous elocution, and lucid ordering of ideas, and noble language. In fact, there was a school of oratory. This is no mere superstition, bred of man's innate tendency to exalt the past above the present. It is a fact that can easily be verified through contemporary records. It is a fact which I myself have verified in the House with my own eyes and ears. More than once I heard there, and it was a pleasure and privilege to hear, a speech made by Sir William Harcourt, and from his speeches I was able to deduce the manner of his coevals and his forerunners. Long past his prime he was, and bearing up with very visible effort against his years. An almost extinct volcano, but sufficient to imagination, these glimpses of the glow that had been, and the sight of these last poor rivulets of the old lava. An almost extinct volcano, but majestic among molehills. Assuredly, the old school was a fine one. It had its faults, of course: floridness, pomposity, too much histrionism. It was, indeed, very like the old school of acting, in its defects as in its qualities. With all its defects, what a relief it is to see one of the old actors among a cast of new ones! How he takes the stage, making himself felt and heard! How surely he achieves his effects in the grand manner! Robustious? Yes. But it is better to exaggerate a style than to have no style at all. That is what is the matter with these others, these quiet, shifty, shamefaced others. They have no style at all. And as is the difference between the old actors and them, so precisely was the difference between Sir William Harcourt and the modern members. I do not desire the new actors to model themselves on the old, whose manner is quite incongruous with the character of modern drama. All I would have them do is to achieve the manner for which they are darkly fumbling. Even so, I do not demand oratory of the modern senators. Oratory I love, but I admit that the time for it is bygone. It belonged to the age of port. On plenty of port the orator spoke, and on plenty of port his audience listened to him. A diet-bound generation can hardly produce an orator, and if by some mysterious throwback an orator actually is produced, he falls very flat. There was in my college at Oxford a little essay society to which I found myself belonging. We used to meet every Thursday evening in the room of this or that member, and when coffee had been handed round, one of us read an essay. A calm, little, mild essay on one of those vast themes that no undergraduate can resist. After this, we had a calm, little, mild discussion. It seems to me that the reader of the paper has hardly laid enough stress on... One of these evenings I can recall most distinctly. A certain freshman had been elected. The man who was to have read an essay had fallen ill, and the freshman had been asked to step into the breach. This he did, with an essay on the ideals of Mazzini, and with strange and terrific effect. During the exordium we raised our eyebrows. Presently we were staring open-mouthed. Where were we? In what wild dream were we drifting? To this day I can recite the peroration. Mazzini is dead, but his spirit lives and can never be crushed. And his motto, the motto that he planted on the gallant banner of the Italian Republic and sealed with his life's blood, remains and shall remain, till through the eternal ages the universal air re-echoes to the inspired shout, God and the People. The freshman had begun to read his essay in a loud, declamatory style. But gradually, knowing with an orator's instinct, I suppose, that his audience was not with him, he had quieted down and become rather nervous. Too nervous to skip, as I am sure he wished to skip, the essential conflagrant passages. But as the end hove in sight, his confidence was renewed. A wave of emotion rose to sweep him ashore upon its crest. He gave the peroration for all it was worth. Mazzini is dead. I can hear now the hushed tone in which he spoke those words, the pause that followed them, and the gradual rising of his voice to a culmination at the words, inspired shout, and then another pause before that husky whisper, God and the People. There was no discussion. We were petrified. We sat like stones. And presently, like shadows, we drifted out into the evening air. The little society met once or twice again, but any activity it still had was but the faint convulsion of a murdered thing. Old wine had been poured into a new bottle, with the usual result. Broken even so, belike, would be the glass roof of the Commons if a member spouted up to it such words as we heard that evening in Oxford. At any rate, the member would be howled down. So strong is the modern distaste for oratory. The day for oratory, as for toping, is past beyond redemption. Debating is the best that can be done and appreciated by so abstemious a generation as ours. You will find a very decent level of debating in the Oxford Union, in the Balham Ethical Society, in the Pimlico Parliament, and elsewhere. But not, I regret to say, in the House of Commons. No one supposes that in a congeries of how many? 670 men chosen by the British public, there will be a very high average of mental capacity. If anyone were so sanguine, a glance at the faces of our conscript fathers along the benches would soon bleed him. I have no doubt that the custom of wearing hats in the House originates in the members' unwillingness to let strangers spy down on the shapes of their heads. But it is not unreasonable to expect that the more active of these gentlemen will, through constant practice, not only in the Senate, but also at elections and public dinners and so forth, have acquired a rough-and-ready professionalism in the art of speaking. It is not unreasonable to expect that they will be fairly fluent, fairly capable of arranging in logical sequence such ideas as they may have formed, and of reeling out words more or less expressive of these ideas. Well, certain of the Irishmen, certain of the Welshmen proceed easily enough. But oh, those Saxon others! Look at them, hark at them, poor dears! See them clutching at their coats and shuffling from foot to foot in travail, while their ideas, ridiculous mice for the most part, get jerked painfully out somehow and anyhow. It seems to me that the honourable member for, the speaker dives to be prompted. Yes, of course, South Clapham, temporizing. The southern division of Clapham. Long pause. His lips form the words, "Where was I?" Oh, yes, the honourable gentleman, the member for South Clapham, seems to me to be in the position of one who, whilst the facts on which his supposition are based, may or may not be in themselves correct, gasps. Yet, inasmuch because, nevertheless, I should say rather, what it comes to is this. The honourable member for South Clapham seems to be labouring under a total, an entire, a complete, emphatic gesture which throws him off his tack, a complete misunderstanding of the things which he himself relies on as a backing up of the things that he would have us take or accept and receive as the right sort of deduction from the facts of the case. Then the poor dear heaves a deep sigh of relief, which is drowned by other members in a hideous cachinnation meant to express mirth. And the odd thing is that the mirth is quite sincere and quite friendly. The speaker has just scored a point, though you mightn't think it. He has just scored a point in the true House of Commons manner. Possibly you have never been to the House of Commons, and suspect that I have caricatured its manner. Not at all. Indeed, to save space in these pages, I have rather improved it. If a phonograph were kept in the House, you would learn from it that the average sentence of the average speaker is an even more grotesque abortion than I have adumbrated. Happily for the prestige of the House, phonographs are excluded. Certain skilled writers, mostly dubbing themselves reporters, are admitted, and by them cosmos is conjured out of chaos. The member for South Clapham appeared to be labouring under a misapprehension of the nature of the facts on which his argument was based. Laughter. That is the finished article that your morning paper offers to you. And you, enjoying the delicious epigram over your tea and toast, are as unconscious of the toil that went to make it, and of the crises through which it passed, as you are of those poor sowers and reapers, planters and sailors and colliers, but for whom there would be no fragrant tea and toast for you. The English are a naturally silent race. The most popular type of national hero is the strong, silent man, and most of the members of the House of Commons are, at any rate, silent members, mercifully silent. Seeing the level attained by such members as have an impulse to speak, I shuddered to conceive an oration by one of those unimpelled members. Perhaps I am too nervous. Surely I am too nervous. Surely the House of Commons manner cannot be a natural growth. Such perfect virtuosity in dufferdom can be acquired only by constant practice. But how comes it to be practised? I can only repeat that the English are a naturally silent race. They are apt to mistrust fluency. Glibness, they call it, and scent behind it the adventurer, the player of the confidence trick or the three-card trick, the robber of the widow and the orphan. Be smooth-tongued, and the Englishman will withdraw from you as quickly as may be, walking sideways like a crab, and looking askance at you with panic in his eyes. But stammer and blurt to him, and he will fall straight under the spell of your transparent honesty. A silly superstition, but there it is, ineradicable. And through it, undoubtedly, has come the House of Commons manner. Sometimes, through sheer nervousness, a new member achieves something like that manner, in so much that his maiden speech is adjudged rich in promise, and the ear of the House is assured to him when next he rises. This is the dangerous time for him. He has conquered his nervousness now, but has not yet acquired that complex and delicate technique whereby a man can produce the illusion that he is striving hopelessly to utter something which, really, he could say with perfect ease. Thus he forfeits the sympathy of the House. Members stroll listlessly out. There is a buzz of conversation along the benches. Perhaps the horrific refrain, "Vide, vide, vide." But the time will come when they shall hear him, years hence, a beacon to show the heights that can be scaled by perseverance. He shall stand fumbling and floundering in a rapt Senate. Well, I take off my hat to virtuosity in any form. I admire Demosthenes, for whom pebbles in the mouth were a means to the end of oratory. I admire the Demosthenes de nos jours, for whom oratory is a means to the end of pebbles in the mouth. But I desire that the intelligent foreigner and the intelligent country cousin be not disappointed when they visit the House of Commons. Hitherto, strangers have expected to find there an exhibition of the art of speaking. That is the fault partly of those reporters to whom I have paid a well-deserved tribute, but it is more especially the fault of those other graphic reporters who write their lurid impressions of the debates. These gentlemen are the most wildly misleading. I don't think they mislead you intentionally. If a man criticises one kind of ill-done thing exclusively, he cannot but, in course of time, lower his standard. Seeing nothing good, he will gradually forget what goodness is, and will accept as good that which is least bad. So it is with the graphic reporter in Parliament. He really does imagine that Hob raked the Treasury bench with a merciless fire of raillery, and that Nob went, as is his way, straight to the root of the subject, and that Chittabob struck a deep note of pathos that will linger long in the memory of all who heard him. If Hob, Nob, and Chittabob happen to be in opposition to the politics of the newspaper which he adorns, he will perhaps tell the truth about their respective performances. But he will tell it without believing it. All his geese are swans, bless him, even when he won't admit it. The moral is that no man should be employed as graphic reporter for more than one session. Then the public would begin to learn the truth about St. Stephen's. Nor need the editors flinch from such a consummation. They used to entertain a theory that it was safest to have the productions at every theatre praised, in case any manager should withdraw his advertisements. But there need be no such fear in regard to St. Stephen's. That establishment does not advertise itself in the press as a place of amusement. Why should the press advertise it gratuitously? For utility's sake, as well as for truth's, I would have the public enlightened. Exposed to ruthless criticism, our Commons might be shamed into an attempt at proficiency in the art of speaking. Then the sessions would be comparatively brief. After all, it is on the nation itself that falls the cost of lighting, warming, and ventilating St. Stephen's during the session. All the aforesaid dufferdom, therefore, increases the burden of the taxpayer. All those hums and haws mean so many pence from the pockets of you, reader, and me. End of section 15. Section 16 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The naming of streets. The rebuilding of London proceeds ruthlessly apace. The humble old houses that dare not scrape the sky are being duly punished for their timidity. Down they come, and in their place are shot up new tenements, quick and high as rockets. And the little old streets, so narrow and exclusive, so shy and crooked, we lose our way in them, do we? We, whose time is money? Our omnibuses can't trundle through them, can't they? Very well, then, down with them. We have no use for them. This is the age of noble arteries. The rebuilding of London is a source of much pride and pleasure to most of London's citizens, especially to them who are county councillors, builders, contractors, navvies, glaziers, decorators, and so forth. There is but a tiny residue of persons who do not swell and sparkle. And of these glum bystanders at the carnival, I am one. Our aloofness is mainly irrational, I suppose. It is due mainly to temperamental Toryism. We say the old is better. This we say to ourselves, every one of us feeling himself thereby justified in his attitude. But we are quite aware that such a postulate would not be accepted by the majority. For the majority, then, let us make some show of ratiocination. Let us argue that, forasmuch as London is an historic city, with many phases and periods behind her, and forasmuch as many of these phases and periods are enshrined in the aspect of her buildings, the constant razure of these buildings is a disservice to the historian not less than to the mere sentimentalist. And that it will, moreover, this is a more telling argument, filch from Englishmen the pleasant power of crowing over Americans, and from Americans the unpleasant necessity of balancing their pity for our present with envy of our past. After all, our past is our point d'appui. Our present is merely a bad imitation of what the Americans can do much better. Ignoring as mere scurrility this criticism of London's present, but touched by my appeal to his pride and its history, the average citizen will reply, reasonably enough, to this effect. By all means, let us have architectural evidence of our epochs, Caroline, Georgian, Victorian, what you will. But why should the Edvardian be ruled out? London is packed full of architecture already. Only by raising much of its present architecture can we find room for commemorating duly the glorious epoch which we have just entered. To this reply there are two rejoinders. 1. Let special suburbs be founded for Edvardian buildings. 2. There are no really Edvardian buildings, and there won't be any. Long before the close of the Victorian era, our architects had ceased to be creative. They could not express in their work the spirit of their time. They could but evolve a medley of old styles, some foreign, some native, all inappropriate. Take the case of Mayfair. Mayfair has for some years been in a state of transition. The old Mayfair, grim and sombre, with its air of selfish privacy and hauteur and leisure, its plain bricked facades, so disdainful of show, was it not redolent of the century in which it came into being? Its wide pavements and narrow roads between, could not one see in them the time when, by day, gentlemen and ladies went out afoot, needing no vehicle to whisk them to a destination, and walked to and fro amply, needing elbow-room for their dignity and their finery, and by night were borne in chairs singly? And those queer little places of worship, those stucco chapels, with their very secular little columns, their ample pews, and their negligible altars, over which one saw the lion and the unicorn fighting, as who should say, for the cross, did they not breathe all the inimitable Erastianism of their period? In qua tequero proseucha, my Lady Powderbox? Alas! Every one of your tabernacles is dust now, dust turned to mud by the tears of the ghost of the Reverend Honeyman, and by my own tears. I have strayed again into sentiment, back to the point, which is that the new houses and streets in Mayfair mean nothing. Let me show you Mount Street. Let me show you that airy stretch of sham antiquity, and defy you to say that it symbolises, how remotely soever, the spirit of its time. Mount Street is typical of the new Mayfair, and the new Mayfair is typical of the new London. In the height of these new houses, in the width of these new roads, future students will find, doubtless, something characteristic of this pressing and bustling age. But from the style of the houses he will learn nothing at all. The style might mean anything, and means, therefore, nothing. Original architecture is a lost art in England, and an art that is once lost is never found again. The Edvardian era cannot be commemorated in its architecture. Erection of new buildings robs us of the past, and gives us in exchange nothing of the present. Consequently, the excuse put by me into the gaping mouth of the average Londoner cannot be accepted. I had no idea that my case was such a good one. Having now vindicated, on grounds of patriotic utility, that which I took to be a merely sentimental prejudice, I may be pardoned for dragging beauty into the question. The new buildings are not only uninteresting, through lack of temporal and local significance, they are also hideous. With all his learned eclecticism, the new architect seems unable to evolve a fake that shall be pleasing to the eye. Not at all pleasing is a mad hodgepodge of early Victorian hospital, Jacobean manor house, Venetian palace, and bride cake, in Gunter's best manner. Yet that, apparently, is the modern English architect's pet ideal. Even when he confines himself to one manner, the result, even if it be in itself decent, is made horrible by vicinity to the work of a rival who has been dabbling in some other manner. Every street in London is being converted into a battlefield of styles, all shrieking at one another, all murdering one another. The tumult may be exciting, especially to the architects, but it is not beautiful. It is not good to live in. However, I am no propagandist. I am not sanguine enough to suppose that I could do anything to stop either the adulteration or the demolition of old streets. I do not wish to infect the public with my own misgivings. On the contrary, my motive for this essay is to inoculate the public with my own placid indifference in a certain matter which seems always to cause them painful anxiety. Whenever a new highway is about to be opened, the newspapers are filled with letters suggesting that it ought to be called by this or that beautiful name: or by the name of this or that national hero. Well, in point of fact, a name cannot, in the long run, make any shadow of difference in our sentiment for the street that bears it. For our sentiment is solely according to the character of the street itself. And, further, a street does nothing at all to keep green the memory of one whose name is given to it. For a street, one name is as good as another. To prove this proposition, let us proceed by analogy of the names borne by human beings. Surnames and Christian names may alike be divided into two classes. 1. Those which, being identical with words in the dictionary, connote something definite. 2. Those which, connoting nothing, may or may not suggest something by their sound. Instances of Christian names in the first class are Rose, Faith; of surnames, Lavender, Badger; of Christian names in the second class, Celia, Mary; of surnames, Jones, Vavasour. Let us consider the surnames in the first class. You will say offhand that Lavender sounds pretty, and that Badger sounds ugly. Very well. Now, suppose that Christian names connoting unpleasant things were sometimes conferred at baptisms. Imagine two sisters named Nettle and Envy. Offhand, you will say that these names sound ugly, whilst Rose and Faith sound pretty. Yet, believe me, there is not, in point of actual sound, one pin to choose, either between Badger and Lavender, or between Rose and Nettle, or between Faith and Envy. There is no such thing as a singly euphonious or a singly cacophonous name. There is no word which by itself sounds ill or well. In combination, names may be made to sound ill or well. A sentence can be musical or unmusical. But in detachment, words are no more preferable one to another in their sound than are single notes of music. What you take to be beauty or ugliness of sound is, indeed, nothing but beauty or ugliness of meaning. You are pleased by the sound of such words as gondola, vestments, chancel, ermine, manor house. They seem to be fraught with a subtle onomatopoeia, severally suggesting, by their sounds, the grace or sanctity or solid comfort of the things which they connote. You murmur them luxuriously, dreamily. Prepare for a slight shock. Scrofula, investments, cancer, vermin, warehouse. Horrible words, are they not? But say gondola scrofula, vestments investments, and so on, and then lay your hand on your heart and declare that the words in the first list are, in mere sound, nicer than the words in the second. Of course they are not. If gondola were a disease, and if scrofula were a beautiful boat peculiar to a beautiful city, the effect of each word would be exactly the reverse of what it is. This rule may be applied to all the other words in the two lists, and these lists might, of course, be extended to infinity. The appropriately beautiful or ugly sound of any word is an illusion by what the word connotes. Beauty sounds as ugly as ugliness sounds beautiful. Neither of them has, by itself, any quality in sound. It follows, then, that the Christian names and surnames in my first class sound beautiful or ugly according to what they connote. The sound of those in the second class depends on the extent to which it suggests any known word more than another. Of course, there might be a name hideous in itself. There might, for example, be a Mr. Griggsbigmiggs. But there is not, And the fact that I, after prolonged study of a postal directory, have been obliged to use my imagination as a factory for a name that connotes nothing and is ugly in itself, may be taken as proof that such a name does not exist, actually. You cannot stump me by citing Mr. Matthew Arnold's citation of the words "Rag is in custody," and his comment that there was no rag by the Ilyssus. Rag has not an ugly sound in itself. Mr. Arnold was jarred merely by its suggestion of something ugly, a rag, and by the cold brutality of the police court reporter in withholding the prefix "Miss" from a poor girl who had got into trouble. If Rag had been brought to his notice as the name of some illustrious old family, Mr. Arnold would never have dragged in the Ilyssus. The name would have had for him a savour of quaint distinction. The suggestion of a rag would never have struck him. For it is a fact that whatever thing may be connoted or suggested by a name is utterly overshadowed by the name's bearer. Unless, as in the case of poor Rag, there is seen to be some connection between the bearer and the thing implied by the name. Roughly, it may be said that all names connote their bearers and them only. To have a beautiful name is no advantage. To have an ugly name is no drawback. I am aware that this is a heresy. In a famous passage, Bulwer Lytton propounded, through one of his characters, a theory that, quote, "it is not only the effect that the sound of a name has on others which is to be thoughtfully considered. The effect that his name produces on the man himself is perhaps still more important. Some names stimulate and encourage the owner, others deject and paralyse him." End quote. Bulwer himself, I doubt not, believed that there was something to this theory. It is natural that a novelist should. He is always at great pains to select, for his every puppet, a name that suggests to him the character which he has ordained for that puppet. In real life, a baby gets its surname by blind heredity, its other names by the blind whim of its parents, who know not at all what sort of a person it will eventually become. And yet, when these babies grow up, their names seem every whit as appropriate as do the names of the romantic puppets. Obviously, thinks the novelist, these human beings must grow to their names, or else we must be viewing them in the light of their names. And the quiet, ordinary people who do not write novels incline to this conjecture. How else can they explain the fact that every name seems to fit its bearer so exactly, to sum him or her up in a flash? The true explanation, missed by them, is that a name derives its whole quality from its bearer, even as does a word from its meaning. The late Sir Redvers Buller, tauredon hupoblespas, spelled in Greek from Plato's Phaedo, 117b, was thought to be peculiarly well fitted with his name. Yet, had it belonged not to him, but to, say, some gentle and thoughtful ecclesiastic, it would have seemed quite as inevitable. Gore is quite as taurine as Buller. And yet, does it not seem to us the right name for the author of Lux Mundi? In connection with him, who is struck by its taurinity? What hint of ovinity would there have been for us if Sir Redvers' surname had happened to be that of him who wrote the essays of Elia? Conversely, Charles Buller seems to us now an impossible nom de vie for Elia. Yet it would have done just as well, really. Even Redvers Buller would have done just as well. Walter Pater means for us, how perfectly, the author of Marius the Epicurean, whilst the author of All Sorts and Conditions of Men was summed up for us not less absolutely in Walter Besant. And yet, if the surnames of these two opposite Walters had been changed at birth, what difference would have been made? Walter Besant would have signified a prose style sensuous in its severity, an exquisitely patient scholarship, an exquisitely sympathetic way of criticism. Walter Pater would have signified no style, but an unslakable thirst for information, and a bustling human sympathy and power of carrying things through. Or take two names often found in conjunction, Johnson and Boswell. Had the dear great oracle been named Boswell, and had the sitter at his feet been named Johnson, would the two names seem to us less appropriate than they do? Should we suffer any greater loss than if salmon were Gluckstein and Gluckstein salmon? Finally, take a case in which the same name was borne by two very different characters. What name could seem more descriptive of a certain illustrious Archbishop of Westminster than Manning? It seems the very epitome of saintly astuteness. But for Cardinal, substitute Mrs. as its prefix, and presto, it is equally descriptive of that dreadful medio-Victorian murderess who in the dock of the Old Bailey wore a black satin gown and thereby created against black satin a prejudice which has but lately died. In itself, black satin is a beautiful thing, yet for many years, by force of association, it was accounted loathsome. Conversely, one knows that many quite hideous fashions in costume have been set by beautiful women. Such instances of the subtle power of association will make clear to you how very easily a name, being neither beautiful nor hideous in itself, can be made hideous or beautiful by its bearer, how inevitably it becomes for us a symbol of its bearer's most salient qualities or defects, be they physical, moral, or intellectual. Streets are not less characteristic than human beings. "Look," cried a friend of mine, whom lately I found studying a map of London, "isn't it appalling? All these streets, thousands of them, in this tiny compass. Think of the miles and miles of drab monotony this map contains." I pointed out to him (it is a thinker's penalty to be always pointing things out to people) that his words were nonsense. I told him that the streets on this map were no more monotonous than the rivers on the map of England, just as there are no two rivers alike, every one of them having its own speed, its own windings, depths and shallows, its own way with the reeds and grasses. So had every street its own claim to an especial nymph, forasmuch as no two streets had exactly the same proportions, the same habitual traffic, the same type of shops or houses, the same inhabitants. In some cases, of course, the difference between the atmosphere of two streets is a subtle difference. But it is always there, not less definite, to anyone who searches for it, than the difference between, say, Hill Street and Pont Street, High Street Kensington and High Street Notting Hill, Fleet Street and the Strand. I have here purposely opposed to each other streets that have obvious points of likeness, but what a yawning gulf of difference is between each couple. Hill Street, with its staid distinction, and Pont Street, with its eager, pushful smartness, its air de petit parvenu, its obvious delight in having been taken up. High Street Notting Hill, down at heels and unashamed, with a placid smile on its broad, ugly face, and High Street Kensington, with its traces of former beauty, and its air of neatness and self-respect, as befits one who, in her day, has been caressed by royalty. Fleet Street, that seething channel of business, and the Strand, that swollen river of business, on whose surface float so many aimless and unsightly objects. In every one of these thoroughfares, my mood and my manner are differently affected. In Hill Street, instinctively, I walk very slowly, sometimes even with a slight limp, as one recovering from an accident in the hunting field. I feel very well bred there, and, though not clever, very proud, and quick to resent any familiarity from those whom elsewhere I should regard as my equals. In Pont Street my demeanour is not so calm and measured. I feel less sure of myself, and adopt a slight swagger. In High Street Kensington I find myself dapper and respectable, with a timid leaning to the fine arts. In High Street Notting Hill I become frankly common. Fleet Street fills me with a conviction that if I don't make haste I shall be jeopardising the national welfare. The Strand utterly unmans me, leaving me with only two sensations. One, a regret that I have made such a mess of my life. Two, a craving for alcohol. These are but a few instances. If I had time, I could show you that every street known to me in London has a definite effect on me, and that no two streets have exactly the same effect. For the most part, these effects differ in kind according only to the different districts and their different modes of life. But they differ in detail according to such specific little differences as exist between such cognate streets as Bruton Street and Curzon Street, Doughty Street and Great Russell Street. Every one of my readers, doubtless, realises that he, too, is thus affected by the character of streets. And I doubt not that for him, as for me, the mere sound or sight of a street's name conjures up the sensation he feels when he passes through that street. For him, probably, the name of every street has hitherto seemed to be also its exact, inevitable symbol, a perfect suggestion of its character. He has believed that the grand or beautiful streets have grand or beautiful names. The mean or ugly streets, mean or ugly names. Let me assure him that this is a delusion. The name of a street, as of a human being, derives its whole quality from its bearer. Oxford Street sounds harsh and ugly. Manchester Street sounds rather charming. Yet Oxford sounds beautiful, and Manchester sounds odious. Oxford turns our thoughts to that adorable dreamer whispering from her spires the last enchantments of the Middle Age. An uproarious monster, belching from its factory chimneys the latest exhalations of hell, that is the image evoked by Manchester. But neither in Manchester Street is there for us any hint of that monster, nor in Oxford Street of that dreamer. The names have become part and parcel of the streets. You see, then, that it matters not whether the name given to a new street be one which in itself suggests beauty, or one which suggests ugliness. In point of fact, it is generally the most pitiable little holes and corners that bear the most ambitiously beautiful names. To anyone who has studied London, such a title as Paradise Court conjures up a dark, fetid alley with untidy fat women gossiping in it, untidy thin women quarrelling across it, a host of haggard and shapeless children sprawling in its mud, and one or two drunken men propped against its walls. Thus, were there an official nomenclator of streets, he might be tempted to reject such names as, in themselves, signify anything beautiful. but his main principle would be to bestow whatever name first occurred to him, in order that he might save time for thinking about something that really mattered. I have yet to fulfill the second part of my promise, show the futility of trying to commemorate a hero by making a street his namesake. By implication, I have done this already, but for the benefit of the less nimble among my readers, let me be explicit. Who, passing through the Cromwell Road, ever thinks of Cromwell, except by accident? What journalist ever thinks of Wellington in Wellington Street? In Marlborough Street, what policeman remembers Marlborough? In St. James's Street, has anyone ever fancied he saw the ghost of a pilgrim wrapped in a cloak, leaning on a staff? Other ghosts are there in plenty. The phantom chariot of Lord Petersham dashes down the slope nightly. Nightly, Mr. Ball Hughes appears in the bow window of White's. At cockcrow, Charles James Fox still emerges from Brooks's. Such men as these were indigenous to the street. Nothing will ever lay their ghosts there. But the ghost of St. James? What should it do in that gallery? Of all the streets that have been named after famous men, I know but one whose namesake is suggested by it. In Regent Street, you do sometimes think of the Regent. And that is not because the street is named after him, but because it was conceived by him, and was designed and built under his auspices, and is redolent of his character and his time. When a national hero is to be commemorated by a street, he must be allowed to design the street himself. The mere plastering up of his name is no mnemonic. End of section 16. Section 17 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Shakespeare's Birthday. My florist has standing orders to deliver, early on the morning of this day, a chaplet of laurel. With it in my hand, I reach by a step-ladder the nobly arched embrasure that is above my central bookcase, and crown there the marble brow of him whose name is the especial glory of our literature, of all literature. The greater part of the morning is spent by me in contemplation of that brow, and in silent meditation. And, year by year, always there intrudes itself into this meditation the hope that Shakespeare's name will, one day, be swept into oblivion. I am not, you will have perceived that I certainly am not, a Baconian. So far as I have examined the evidence in the controversy, I do not feel myself tempted to secede from the side on which, rightly, inasmuch as it is the obviously authoritative side, every ignorant person ranges himself. Even the hottest Baconian, filled with the stubbornest conviction, will, I fancy, admit in confidence that the utmost thing that could at present be said for his conclusions by a judicial investigator is that they are not proven. To be convinced of a thing without being able to establish it is the surest recipe for making oneself ridiculous. The Baconians have thus made themselves very ridiculous, and that alone is reason enough for not wishing to join them. And yet my heart is with them, and my voice urges them to carry on the fight. It is a good fight, in my opinion, and I hope they will win it. I do not at all understand the furious resentment they rouse in the bosoms of the majority. Mistaken they may be, but why yell them down as knavish blasphemers? Our reverence, after all, is given not to an Elizabethan named William Shakespeare, who was born at Stratford and married and migrated to London and became a second-rate actor, and afterwards returned to Stratford and made a will and composed a few lines of doggerel for the tombstone under which he was buried. Our reverence is given to the writer of certain plays and sonnets. To that second-rate actor, because we believe he wrote those plays and sonnets, we give that reverence. But our belief is not such as we give to the proposition that 1 and 2 make 3. It is a belief that has to be upheld by argument when it is assailed. When a man says to us that 1 and 2 make 4, we smile and are silent. But when he argues, point by point, that in Bacon's life and writings there is nothing to show that Bacon might not have written the plays and sonnets, and that there is much to show that he did write them, and that, in what we know about Shakespeare, there is little evidence that Shakespeare wrote those works, and much evidence that he did not write them, then we pull ourselves together, marshalling all our facts and all our literary discernment, so as to convince our interlocutor of his error. But why should we not do our task urbanely? The ciphers, certainly, are stupid and tedious things, deserving no patience. But the more intelligent Baconians spurn them as airily as do you or I. Our case is not so strong that the arguments of these gentlemen can be ignored, and naughty temper does but hamper us in the task of demolition. If Bacon were proved to have written Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, would mankind be robbed of one of those illusions which are necessary to its happiness and welfare? If so, we have a good excuse for browbeating the poor Baconians. But it isn't so, really and truly. Suppose that one fine morning Mr. Blank, an ardent Baconian, stumbled across some long-sought document which proved irrefragably that Bacon was the poet and Shakespeare an impostor. What would be our sentiments? For the second-rate actor we should have not a moment's sneaking kindness or pity. On the other hand, should we not experience an everlasting thrill of pride and gladness in the thought that he who had been the mightiest of our philosophers had been also, by some unimaginable grace of heaven, the mightiest of our poets? Our pleasure in the plays and sonnets would be, of course, not one whit greater than it is now, but the pleasure of hero worship for their author would be more than reduplicated. The Greeks revelled in reverence of Heracles by reason of his 12 labours. They would have been disappointed had it proved to them that 6 of those labours had been performed by some quite obscure person. The divided reverence would have seemed tame. Conversely, it is pleasant to revere Bacon as we do now, and to revere Shakespeare as we do now. But a wild ecstasy of worship were ours could we concentrate on one of those 2 demigods all the reverence which now we apportion to each apart. It is for this reason, mainly, that I wish success to the Baconians. But there is another reason, less elevated perhaps, but not less strong for me. I should like to watch the multifarious comedies which would spring from the downfall of an idol to which for 3 centuries a whole world had been kneeling. Glad fancy makes for me a few extracts from the issue of a morning paper dated a week after the publication of Mr. Blank's discovery. This from a column of literary notes. From Balham, Sydenham, Lewisham, Clapham, Hernhill, and Peckham comes the news that the local Shakespeare societies have severally met and decided to dissolve. Other suburbs are expected to follow. This from the same column. Mr. Sidney Lee is now busily engaged on a revised edition of his monumental biography of Shakespeare. Yesterday, His Majesty the King graciously visited Mr. Lee's library in order to personally inspect the progress of the work, which, in its complete form, is awaited with the deepest interest in all quarters. And this, a leaderette. Yesterday, at a meeting of the Parks Committee of the London County Council, it was unanimously resolved to recommend at the next meeting of the Council that the statue of Shakespeare in Leicester Square should be removed. This decision was arrived at in view of the fact that during the past few days the well-known effigy has been the centre of repeated disturbances, and is already considerably damaged. We are surprised to learn that there are in our midst persons capable of doing violence to a noble work of art merely because its subject is distasteful to them. But even the most civilised communities have their fits of vandalism. 'Tis true, 'tis pity, and pity 'tis true. And this from a page of advertisements. To be let or sold, a commodious and desirable mansion at Stratford-on-Avon, delightful flower and kitchen gardens, hot and cold water on every floor, within easy drive of station, hitherto home of Miss Marie Corelli. And this again from the literary notes. Mr. Hall Caine is in town. Yesterday, at the Authors' Club, he passed almost unrecognised by his many friends, for he has shaved his beard and moustache, and has had his hair cropped quite closely to the head. This measure he has taken, he says, owing to the unusually hot weather prevailing. A sonnet, too, printed in large type on the middle page, entitled To Shakespeare, signed by the latest fashionable poet, and beginning thus: O undetected during so long years, O irrepleviably infamous, stand forth. A cable, too, from our own correspondent in New York. This afternoon the Carmania came into harbour. Among the passengers was Mr. J. Pierpont Morgan, who had come over in personal charge of Anne Hathaway's cottage, his purchase of which for £2,000,000 excited so much attention on your side a few weeks ago. Mr. Blank's sensational revelations not having been published to the world till 2 days after the Carmania left Liverpool, the millionaire collector had, of course, no cognizance of the same. On disembarking, he proceeded straight to the Customs Office and inquired how much duty was to be imposed on the cottage. On being courteously informed that the article would be passed into the country free of charge, he evinced considerable surprise. I then ventured to approach Mr. Morgan and to hand him a journal containing the cabled summary of Mr. Blank's disclosures, which he proceeded to peruse. His comments I must reserve for the next mail, the cable clerks here demurring to their transmission. Only a dream? But a sweet one. Bustle about, Baconians, and bring it true. Don't listen to my florist. End of section 17. Section 18 of Yet Again by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Homecoming. Belike, returning from a long pilgrimage in which you have seen many strange men and strange cities, and have had your imagination stirred by marvellous experiences, you have never, at the very end of your journey, almost in sight of your home, felt suddenly that all you had been seeing and learning was as naught, a pack of negligible illusions, faint and forgotten. From me, however, this queer sensation has not been withheld. It befell me a few days ago, in a cold grey dawn, at the buffet at Dover Harbour. I had spent 2 months far away, wandering and wondering, and now I had just fulfilled 2/3 of the little tripartite journey from Paris to London. I was sleepy, as one always is after that brief and twice broken slumber. I was chilly, for is not the dawn always bleak at Dover, and perforated always with a bleak and drizzling rain? I was sad, for I had watched from the deck the white cliffs of Albion coming nearer and nearer to me, towering over me, and in the familiar drizzle looking to me more than ever ghastly, for that I had been so long and so far away from them. Often, though that harsh, chalky coast had thus borne down on me, I had never yet felt so exactly and lamentably like a criminal arrested on an extradition warrant. In its sleepy, chilly shell, my soul was still shuddering and whimpering. Piteously it conjured me not to take it back into this cruel humdrum. It rose up and fawned on me. "Down, sir, down," said I sternly. I pointed out to it that needs must when the devil drives, and that it ought to think itself a very lucky soul for having had 2 happy sunny months of fresh and curious adventure. "A sorrow's crown of sorrow," it murmured, "is remembering happier things." I declared the sentiment to be as untrue as was the quotation trite, and told my soul that I looked keenly forward to the pleasure of writing, in collaboration with it, that book of travel for which I had been so sedulously amassing notes and photographs by the way. This colloquy was held at a table in the buffet. I was sorry, for my soul's sake, to be sitting there. Britannia owns nothing more crudely and inalienably Britannic than her buffets. The barmaids are but incarnations of her own self, thinly disguised. The stale buns and the stale sponge cakes must have been baked, one fancies, by her own heavy hand. Of her everything is redolent. She it is that has cut the thick stale sandwiches, bottled the bitter beer, brewed the unpalatable coffee. Cold and hungry though I was, one sip of this coffee was one sip too much for me. I would not mortify my body by drinking more of it, although I had to mortify my soul by lingering over it till one of the harassed waiters would pause to be paid for it. I was somewhat comforted by the aspect of my fellow travellers at the surrounding tables. Dank, dishevelled, dismal, they seemed to be resenting as much as I the return to the dear homeland. I suppose it was the contrast between them and him that made me stare so hard at the large young man who was standing on the threshold and surveying the scene. He looked, as himself would undoubtedly have said, fit as a fiddle, or right as rain. His cheeks were rosy, his eyes sparkling. He had his arms akimbo, and his feet planted wide apart. His grey bowler rested on the back of his head, to display a sleek coating of hair plastered down over his brow. In his white satin tie shone a dubious but large diamond. There was the counter-attraction of geraniums and maidenhair fern in his buttonhole. So fresh was the nosegay that he must have kept it in water during the passage. Or perhaps these vegetables had absorbed by mere contact with his tweeds the subtle secret of his own immarcescibility. I remembered now that I had seen him, without realising him, on the platform of the Gare du Nord. Gay Paris was still written all over him, but evidently he was no repiner. Unaccountable though he was, I had no suspicion of what he was about to do. I think you will hardly believe me when I tell you what he did. A traveller's tale, you will say with a shrug. Yet I swear to you that it is the plain and solemn truth. If you still doubt me, you have the excuse that I myself hardly believed the evidence of my eyes. In the buffet of Dover Harbour, in the cold grey dawn, in the brief interval between boat and train, the large young man, shooting his cuffs, strode forward, struck a confidential attitude across the counter, and began to flirt with the barmaid. Open-mouthed, fascinated, appalled, I watched this monstrous and unimaginable procedure. I was not near enough to overhear what was said, but I knew by the respective attitudes that the time-honoured ritual was being observed strictly by both parties. I could see the ice of haughty indifference thawing little by little under the fire of gallant raillery. I could fix the exact moment when 'Indeed?' became 'I dare say,' and when 'Well, I must say' gave place to 'Go along,' and when 'Oh, I don't mind you, not particularly,' was succeeded by 'Who gave you them flowers?' All in the cold grey dawn. The cry of 'Take your places, please,' startled me into realisation that all the other passengers had vanished. I hurried away, leaving the young man still in the traditional attitude which he had assumed from the first, one elbow sprawling on the counter, one foot cocked over the other. My porter had put my things into a compartment exactly opposite the door of the buffet. I clambered in. Just as the guard blew his whistle, the young man, or monster, came hurrying out. He winked at me. I did not return his wink. I suppose I ought really to have raised my hat to him. Pre-eminently, he was one of those who have made England what it is. But they are the very men whom one does not care to meet just after long truancy in preferable lands. He was the backbone of the nation, but ought backbones to be exposed? Though I would rather not have seen him then and there, I did realise, nevertheless, the overwhelming interest of him. I knew him to be a stranger sight, a more memorable and instructive than any of the fair sights I had been seeing. He made them all seem nebulous and unreal to me. Beside me lay my despatch box. I unlocked it, drew from it all the notes and all the photographs I had brought back with me. These, one by one, methodically, I tore up, throwing their fragments out of the window, not grudging them to the wind. End of section 18.